1947. A growing hatred and bitterness toward his wife who had deserted him, and toward his mother-in-law and sister-in-law culminated in his decision to kill these 3 women. I relate the story as he told it to me, in his own language. To strengthen myself for this gory task I went into a bar. A few more drinks would give me the courage to commit this triple murder. As I entered the bar I saw a young man by the name of Carl drinking coffee. Although I had hated Carl from boyhood, I was utterly astounded to note his immaculate appearance, and I was also astonished to see him drinking coffee in a bar where he had spent on an average of $400 a month for drinks alone. Also I was mystified by what seemed a strange light on his face. Being fascinated by his appearance, I approached Carl and asked, "What happened to you, that you are drinking coffee?" Quote, "I have not had a drink for a year," Carl replied. I was utterly amazed, because Carl and I had been on many drinking bouts together. A strange incident in this affair is that, even though I hated Carl, I was strangely moved. I could not help but listen when he asked, "Ed, did you ever want to quit drinking?" Yes, I have quit 1,000 times, I replied. Carl smiled and said, "If you really want to do something about your problem, get sober and attend a meeting at the Presbyterian Church at 9 on Saturday. It is a meeting of Alcoholics Anonymous." I told him I had no interest in religion, but that maybe I would come. I was unimpressed, but still I could not get that light in his eyes out of my mind. Carl did not insist that I attend the meeting, but repeated that, if I wanted to do something for myself, he and his associates had an answer to my problem. After making that statement, Carl left, and I stood up to the bar to order a drink, but somehow it had lost its appeal. So, instead, I went home, the only home I had remaining, my mother's home. May I explain that I had been married for 17 years to a very fine girl, but being an impatient person, and having no faith in me due to my drinking, she finally decided upon getting a divorce, so not only my job and all my material assets, but my home also were completely lost. Upon getting to my mother's home I wrestled with a bottle until 6 a.m., but still could not take the drink. I kept thinking of Carl's appearance. So on Saturday morning I went to Carl, and asked him what I could do to keep from taking a drink until 9 o'clock that night, when the meeting would be held. Carl said, "Every time you come to a bar, or whiskey sign or beer garden, just say one little prayer, please. God, get me past this place," and then he added, "Run like hell. That will be cooperating with God. He will hear your prayer and the running will be your part." Quote, I did exactly as Carl told me to do. For many hours, anxious and shaky, accompanied by my sister, I walked around the streets of the town. Finally at 8 o'clock my sister said, "Ed, there are 7 drinking joints between here and the place where you are to attend the meeting. You go by yourself, and if you don't make it, and come home drunk, we will still love you and hope for the best, but somehow I feel that this meeting will be different than any you ever attended." With God's help I got by those 7 places. At the church entrance I happened to look around, and the sign over one of my favorite drinking places glared me straight in the eyes. The battle to decide whether to go into that bar or into the Alcoholics Anonymous meeting is one I shall never forget, but a power greater than myself pulled me to the meeting. Upon entering the meeting room I was utterly astounded to receive the firm handshake of my ex-hated friend, Carl. My resentment toward him was disappearing. A round of introductions began to many men in all walks of life: doctors, lawyers, bricklayers, millwrights, coal miners, construction workers, plasterers, laborers, all types were there. I had been drinking with some of these men for the last 10 to 25 years, and here they were all sober on a Saturday night, and, above all, they were happy. What happened at that meeting is rather vague. All I know is that a rebirth had taken place. I felt different deep within. Happily leaving the meeting room at midnight, I went home with a glorious airlifting feeling, and slept peaceably for the first time in more than 5 years. Upon awakening the next morning, I recall something clearly saying to me, "There is a power greater than yourself. If you will turn your will and your life over to the care of God as you understand Him, He will give you strength." Quote, it was Sunday morning, and I decided to go to church. I attended a service where the preacher was a man whom I had hated from childhood. The author wishes to comment at this point how inevitably hate is associated with emotional and spiritual sickness. When the mind is emptied of hate, a long step has been taken toward recovery. Love is a tremendous curative force. This preacher was one of those sedate, swallow-tailed coat-wearing Presbyterian ministers. I had no use for him, but that was my fault. He was all right really. Sat nervously through the singing and the collection taking. Then the preacher read his scripture, and his sermon was based upon the theme, "Never belittle anyone's experience." He had it. I shall never forget that sermon, as long as I live. It taught me a valuable lesson never to belittle an experience, because someone had it, for he and God know the depth and sincerity of that experience. Later I came to love this minister as one of the greatest, most sincere men I have ever known. Just when my new life began, is a matter that is difficult to determine. Whether it was when I met Carl in the bar, or wrestling past the drinking places, or at the Alcoholics Anonymous meeting, or at the church, I do not know. But I, who had been a hopeless alcoholic for 25 years, suddenly became a sober man. I could never have done this alone, for I had tried it 1,000 times and failed. But I drew upon a higher power, and the higher power, which is God, did it. I have known the narrator of the foregoing story for several years. Since becoming dry he has had to face some difficult financial and other problems, but never once has he weakened. In talking with him, I find myself strangely moved. It isn't what he says, or even the way he says it, but one is conscious of a power emanating from this man. He is not a famous person. He is an everyday, hard-working salesman, but the higher power is in him, flowing through him, operating within his experience, and it transmits itself to others. It transmitted itself to me. This chapter is not intended as a dissertation on alcoholism, although I will use still another reference in connection with this problem. Cite these experiences to show conclusively that, if there is a power able to deliver a person from alcoholism, this same power can help any other person to overcome any other form of defeat he may face. There is nothing more difficult to overcome than the problem of alcoholism. The power that can accomplish that difficult feat can, I assure you, help you to overcome your difficulties whatever they may be. Let me give still another experience. I narrate this incident for the same purpose, namely, to emphasize that there is a power which can be applied, drawn upon, and used that mysteriously but surely gives people who demonstrate faith the most remarkable victories. In the Hotel Roanoke at Roanoke, Virginia, one night a man who has since become a good friend told me the following story. 2 years before he had read my book, A Guide to Confident Living. At that time he was considered by himself, and by others, to be an utterly hopeless alcoholic. He is a businessman in Virginia town and is of such ability that despite his drinking problem he was able to keep going with fair success. He had absolutely no control over his drinking, however, and evident deterioration was taking place. Upon reading the book above mentioned, the idea was lodged in its mind that if he could only get to New York he could be cured of his difficulty. He came to New York, but was dead drunk when he arrived. A friend took him to a hotel and left him. He recovered sufficient consciousness to call a bellboy, and told him that he wanted to go to the town's hospital, a famous institution for alcoholics, presided over by the late Dr. Silkworth, one of the greatest men in the field of alcoholism, now deceased, but never to be forgotten. After robbing him of $100 or more which he had in his pocket, the bellboy delivered him to the hospital. After several days of treatment, Dr. Silkworth came in to see him and said, "Charles, I think we have done for you all that we can do. I have a feeling that you are well." This was not Dr. Silkworth's usual practice, and the fact that he handled this case in this manner causes one to sense the guiding hand of a higher power. Still somewhat shaky, Charles made his way downtown until he found himself outside the office door of the Marble Collegiate Church, 1 West 29th Street, New York City. It happened to be a legal holiday and the church was closed. Other than such holidays the church is always open. He stood there hesitantly. He had hoped that he might go into the church and pray. Not being able to gain entrance, he did a strange thing. He took from his wallet one of his business cards, and dropped it through the mail slot in the door. The instant he did that, a tremendous wave of peace came over him. He had an amazing sense of release. He put his head against the door and sobbed like a baby, but he knew that he was free, that some tremendous change had happened to him, the validity of which is attested by the fact that from that minute on there has been no turning back. He has lived in complete sobriety from that moment. There are several features about this incident which mark it as impressive. For one, Dr. Silkworth seemed to have released him from the hospital at the proper psychological, spiritual, and shall we say supernatural moment, indicating that the doctor himself was the subject of divine guidance. When Charles told me the story in the Hotel Roanoke 2 years after it happened, I had a feeling as he related it that I had heard it before in precise detail. But he had never told me the story. In fact, I had never previously talked to him. It occurred to me that perhaps he had written the story to me, and I had read it, but he said he had never written me. I then asked him if he had told the story to one of my secretaries, associates, or any other person who could have related it to me, but he said he had never told the story to any other individual save his wife, and I had not met her until that night. Apparently this incident had been transmitted to my subconscious at the time it happened, for now I remembered it. Why did he drop the card in the mail slot? Perhaps he was symbolically reporting to his spiritual home, reporting to God. It was a dramatic and symbolic separation of himself from his defeat, and the turning to a higher power which immediately took him out of himself and healed him. The incident indicates that, if there is deep desire, intensity of longing, and a sincere reaching out after the power, that it will be given. In this chapter I have related victory stories out of human experience, each in its own way indicating the continual presence and availability of a life-renewing power, beyond but resident within ourselves. Your problem may not be alcoholism, but the fact that the higher power can heal a person of this most difficult malady emphasizes the tremendous truth related in this chapter, and throughout the entire book, and that there is no problem,